My name's Christian Henson and I'm a film, TV and games composer. I've written about 50 orchestral film scores, over a couple of hundred TV shows and a couple of AAA games. The thing is, I never studied music. Okay, so to be totally candid with you, first time I tried to write a piece of orchestral music, bearing in mind that I don't read music, haven't studied harmony or orchestration, I was so utterly petrified by the prospect that I started crying on my own in my studio. Not a single tear, like tears and snot, blubbing. I was so consumed by this, I decided to call my girlfriend up, crying, tears and snot. She left me 2 weeks later. On reflection, I had nothing to worry about. The allure of orchestral does paint it as this kind of closed fortress, an impenetrable zone that you can only gain access to if you go to the conservatoire. I have good news for you, however. The 20th century were this period of time which started at the beginning of the 20th century with a kind of quite a conservative approach to classical or concert music, whatever you want to call it. And then it went through this incredible period of just being bonkers, from fishes being thrown into pianos to piano pieces that are entirely silent, so impenetrable to listen to, so intellectual but not enjoyable. It was emptying concert halls around the world. But this bloody revolution was necessary because it leaves us in this amazing privileged position of there being no rules, no laws other than the laws of physics. If you want a tuba player to play in the piccolo kind of register, you may be disappointed by the end results, for example. So I hope this film helps to allay any fears that you may be harbinging about the idea of creating orchestral music and to offer you a quick guide to electronic orchestration day one. Now, as I said, I'm self-taught, so I've arrived at a lot of conclusions not through reading books and going to school, but by programming orchestral samples and working with orchestras. In a very broad and callous sense, I feel that music kind of performs three functions or operates in three different ways. One is with an ensemble, like as a chorus or as a pad, if you will, so rich, thick chords. The other as a melody line, and that can be a top line, that can be a cello line, that can be an answering phrase in one of the instruments in the middle. And the other is to form an accompaniment. And what's convenient about this rather kind of naive view of music is that orchestral samples also operate in three slightly different ways that kind of matches these three operational modes, if you will. I'm going to start this composition just by demonstrating that playing orchestral samples isn't really any different from playing a synth. There's just a couple of extra bits you have to consider to get the best out of them. I've got a tempo selected, I've got a piece in my head, and it's, as with most of my music, it starts with a piano piece. So I'm just going to lay that down. It's the Olafur Arnalds felt piano, which I think is quite an inspiring sound. What I like about inspiring sounds is that you don't have to kind of overcompose, not too many notes. Let's quantize that because I'm actually going to remove this piano at some point. I want this to be a totally orchestral piece. So let's start with the strings. I think it's important to point out that this isn't a logic tutorial. This is basic, very, very basic kind of concepts that will work in any DAW or digital audio workstation. I'm using Contact with a bunch of Spitfire samples, but again, any strings will do. And in fact, I'll link below this thing called Labs strings, which are actually free, which are good to try stuff out on. But I'm basically going to concentrate on a library called Albion 1, which Spitfire makes, and it's very much an entry point to really lush, big, epic sounding scores. It's also recorded in what's known as ensembles. Now, in an orchestra, you tend to have different sections. So, for example, you've got first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, basses. What we've done here is just recorded it as one. So it just very much works like a synth, but it sounds like an orchestra. I'll get onto the woodwinds and brass in a minute. So I'm just going to pull these strings in. So along the bottom are what we call articulations. These are playing styles. Violins don't inherently sound very nice when you play them, so you've got to do all sorts of things to make them sound sonorous and beautiful. And all of these different kind of hacks of the instrument are represented in styles, whether they be shorts or plucked or playing with vibrato. They have these little mute things that go on that make it sound really silky. And what I'm going to go to is this one here. It says consort. That is a muted sound. It has a lovely silky sound, very popular in modern film scores these days. This is basically a long articulation, which is what we use for kind of the choral paddy stuff. And the thing that's unique about a violin is they can play notes infinitely. All they do is they just keep bowing, keep that finger down to form which note they're playing, and they just can bow for as long as you like. Unlike the piano, where the notes die out, and unlike winds and brass, where they actually have to take a breath. So that's worth bearing in mind. One of the routes to successful orchestral programming is to really understand how the instruments and how the orchestra works. And there's some very basic principles. But basically, certainly with strings, you basically have 5 voices. So you have your firsts, your second violins, violas, cellos, and basses. If you start writing like loads of cluster chords, like... But I think it's quite good to try and limit the number of voices you have with strings. And with big strings, big wide gaps work really well. So let's program this in. Now I'm using this little thing here, which is made by Palette Gear, incredibly expensive for what it does. You can get much cheaper alternatives. So what I'm using here is expression, which is just basically volume. It's, the way I say it is, it's a way of balancing one instrument against another. And this is dynamic control, so this crossfades between all of the different kind of loudnesses that we've recorded with the strings to give you those all important timbral differences as well as an increase in volume. So if we just have a listen. So you can hear the sonic difference, but also maybe feel on a human level the kind of greater intensity the further you go up. So what I tend to do is I either record with both hands and then put this kind of information in afterwards, because this is what is going to help you shape it in a very kind of musical and human sense. Or I just do one hand at a time and record it simultaneously. I'm going to do the latter in this case. So here we go. When I first started writing orchestral music, I really felt that, I should try and make every voice a different note. And what you find is, certainly where basses is concerned, is they tend to track the cellos in octaves. So just like I played on the piano earlier, it's just going to be boring old octaves, but they do sound great. I'm also just going to turn down the piano there. It's just really a guide, so I really want you to hear what I'm doing with the strings. So let's go in with these cellos and basses. Again, it's all recorded together, so just think of it as low strings, basically. Okay, so that's the kind of paddy stuff done there. Now, what about using strings as an accompaniment? there's this kind of intro section here. I am going to be cutting out the piano. Now, the difficulty with strings playing a piano part is pianos, they have a kind of a big percussive start and then they decay out. So that kind of dun, 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 dun sound isn't going to sound so great with strings because they don't really play that kind of shape. They don't have that ringing tone, especially with the sustain pedal down. So I'm going to come up with something that's just a bit more stringy. I'm going to use something called an ostinato, which just basically means it's a kind of a repeating, very simple rhythmic pattern. So let's just boot up another Albion one, and I'm going to go to this. So these short notes, they kind of fall into this accompanying kind of operation mode, and these don't use the dynamic controller to switch between the different levels of note. They use velocity. So no added reverb, this is just the sound of the samples. We record it in a really nice big room, so no need to add reverb if you don't want to. Great, now you can see what I'm kind of doing is I'm simulating very much the pattern that I was doing with this fader, but with velocity. And you'll find with orchestral music, it tends to come in these waves. If you just were to write some notes on a page for musicians to play without any phrase marking, they would naturally play in these kind of waves. So that's the kind of middle accompany part. Now also we had some bass notes in the piano, so I'm going to actually just switch to something called pizzicato, which is plucked for the cellos and basses, and you'll hear with the room that we've recorded in, it really rings out. It's really quite lovely. Now remember, I want to take out the piano, so what's happening is we're losing the momentum as the strings take over. Now this is when you can use the different sections of the orchestra to kind of take over. And as you'll see later on, what's great about the orchestra, it has so much colour and dynamic. You can turn quite a repetitive and boring piano piece into something that really feels like it's changing even when compositionally it isn't. So I'm going to switch to some woodwinds to help with the accompaniment for this next section. So this is our winds acting as an accompaniment. But the things that woodwinds are particularly great at is melodic lines, particularly top lines. So what I'm going to do is use the third category of sample, a legato patch, to create these very realistic sounding top lines, particularly for the intro over here. Now, the thing about legato samples is they work similar to pads in the sense that you need to use your expression and dynamics to go through the different timbral changes as they get louder and quieter. But they're monophonic. They only play one note at a time. Just like if you were singing, you can only sing one note at a time. And this is where I think it's really important also to try and empathise with what the instruments can do. It doesn't require a huge amount of study. You just have to understand that unlike strings with their rebowing, woodwinds require breath coming out and into the instrument in order to sound. And therefore, they need to take a breath from time to time. So again, to achieve realistic results, you have to imagine, I think it's quite good sometimes to actually blow out as you're playing the woodwind parts. And this empathy is important because eventually, I'm certain, you'll be working with live musicians of your own. You don't want to give them a piece of music for them to go, well, where do I take my breath? So not only does it help with the realism of the orchestral programming, that kind of discipline will help you when you actually start working with live musicians. So if you see here, what we need to do with legatos is join the notes up. And what's really clever about the samples is they work out what interval you're playing and they insert the kind of transition between the two notes. So they're slightly more laggy than the other slightly more standard synth sounding articulations. Good thing about woodwind players is they can probably blow out longer than we can, but I think it's very good exercise to blow as you're doing, going, okay, this is going to start getting a bit tiring, so take a little note here. And what I'm going to do is create what's called counterpoint, which is just like question and answer in the low woodwinds, which is going to be exactly the same line. And you'll see this will help go over the breath they're taking. So they're working in concert with each other. Someone's taking a breath, someone else is playing. So I'm taking out the piano and I really want the orchestra to take this composition on. So what I'm simply going to do is duplicate that across there and just make some changes. Very simply here, I'm going to transpose that up an octave. And remembering, at the moment I'm only playing two notes in my right hand. So basically the firsts and seconds and violas are kind of divvying up these two notes. So what I want to do here, very, very common, is for the first violins to play an octave above the second violins. So all I'm going to do is simply duplicate that top line there. Poor violas, they do get to play the more boring parts. And I think what I'll also do is add in the woodwind legatos at the top. Great stuff. Let's just add a bit to this middle accompanying section. Great, so starting to sound really dramatic. Now, there's a bit of a kind of gap between the high strings and the low strings. We've lost a bit of our lovely body and weight, and this is what brass are excellent for, and how I love using brass is to provide the chocolatey middle. So let's pull up some brass there. I'm just going to do some housework, and let's go to brass. And in this room, Air Studios, the hall that we record it in, the brass just sounds mental. So I'm using the mid-long. Let's just see if that's the right register. Now, when brass gets very, very loud, it becomes very kind of brassy, has that slightly, I wouldn't say farty qualities, unfair, but it's very rasping. I'm into this bit. So I'm going to artificially boost this so they stay kind of very horn-like and kind of sophisticated sounding. So let's have a listen to adding those in there. So a little bit of quantize on there, and let's feed in this modulation. I've got to be really careful it doesn't get too brassy. Might like kind of open up the brass a little bit right at the end, but I've just got to keep this warm, moving, chocolatey kind of feel. Expression all the way up. And just one final thing at the very end there, just a little refrain. So many colours from the same instruments. Let's just have a little tidy up here. You can see that squiggly boggling, so let's just smooth that out. And I'm just going to draw some more natural stuff in. And there we go. That's kind of it. It really is as simple as that. It's just playing a synth, using your expression, imagining that you're the musician, and just, you know, bearing in mind there's 5 voices in the strings, so don't overload it with notes, that when you're using accompaniments, short notes, make sure you use the kind of the velocity to really make things sound human, and when you're using legatos, just one note at a time, join the notes up so the sampler knows which transitions to put in between the notes. Now, this kind of stuff usually would take me an afternoon to do. I'll go in there and I'll do all sorts of tidying up and, you know, making sure the velocities are just what I want. I may move, say, the legatos. I may give them like a negative delay, so they're just a little bit more in time, because, as I say, they're quite laggy. As a final note, you know, this idea of empathizing with the instruments, I'm actually going to recommend a couple of books. Someone said to me, books, what are those? They're like kind of websites made out of paper. Unfortunately, the internet really hasn't got up to speed yet on just a basic kind of reference model of what each instrument does. So there's 2 books which are brilliant, by either, depending which, I don't know, by either or either. I have both. Now, they're not to read, they're just, as I have, just sitting in your studio, and they're just really handy. This Samuel Adler, you can see it. Don't use it often these days, and it's got great reference sections. So basically, it's just basically done by each instrument. So if you're writing for a clarinet, say, for the first time, it's just worth just giving, it's literally like 2 pages, gives you an idea of the ranges, what they like doing, what they don't like doing, and, you know, bear in mind that they have to take a breath from time to time. The most important tool you have is not your theoretical knowledge. In fact, the lack of theoretical knowledge can help you sculpt a style that is unique to you. The most important tool you possess is these, and your taste. Your aesthetic, your loves of music that you've listened to all of your life, which will form your own personal heritage. Follow that bliss. Follow what you believe to be good, what stimulates you. Don't try to be someone else. Be yourself. And whatever you do, never ever fear orchestral music. Anyone can make it. Thanks, as always, for watching. If you've liked this tutorial, day 1, I could possibly do a day 2, so let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to do another one, and I'll happily oblige. So, just let's run it down as is. If you like what I've done, hit like. If you haven't subscribed yet, loads of exciting stuff coming up. And if you hit the little bell button, that'll notify you the next time we put a video up. See you next time.